The evil granny who never sleeps. And she's watching you. Part 1: The Arrival. The rain poured relentlessly, drumming against the car's windshield like ghostly fingers tapping to be let inside. Hannah shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders as she stared out into the dark, empty road ahead. The only light came from the dim glow of the dashboard and the occasional flicker of lightning illuminating the vast, desolate countryside. "Almost there," her mother muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Hannah glanced at her younger brother, Jake, who was curled up in the back seat, half asleep. He had protested about coming along, but their mother had insisted. It was only for a few months until she could sort things out in the city. Their father had left them, and money was tight. Grandma Edith had offered them a place to stay. So, Hannah barely remembered her. The last time she had seen Grandma Edith, she was only 5 years old. There were vague memories: long gray hair, deep-set eyes, and a peculiar way of staring without blinking. Her mother had never talked about her much, only mentioning that she lived differently than most. As they turned onto the gravel driveway, the house loomed ahead, a monstrous old Victorian home, its wooden frame creaking under the weight of the wind. The porch light flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows across the walls. Hannah swallowed hard. There was something wrong about the place. Their mother parked the car and let out a tired sigh. "All right, we're here. Let's not make this harder than it has to be, okay?" Jake groaned, rubbing his eyes. "I hate this already." Hannah couldn't blame him. They climbed out, their shoes sinking into the wet ground as they approached the porch. The air was thick with a scent of damp wood and something else. Something stale, like old fabric left in a sealed trunk for too long. Then the door creaked open before they could even knock. Grandma Edith stood in the doorway, her presence swallowing the dim light behind her. Her skin was papery, stretched too tightly over her bones, and her eyes, God, her eyes, were like black marbles, unblinking, staring straight at them. "You're late," she said, her voice dry and brittle. "Sorry, the storm slowed us down," their mother said quickly, forcing a smile. Grandma Edith stepped aside. "Come in. Quickly." The moment they crossed the threshold, a heavy sense of unease settled over Hannah like a weighted blanket. The house smelled of lavender and something metallic underneath. Old, tattered furniture filled the sitting room, and thick curtains were drawn over the windows, blocking out any view of the outside. "You must be exhausted," Grandma Edith said, her gaze lingering on Hannah and Jake. "I've prepared your rooms." Jake clung to their mother's coat. "I don't want to stay here," he whispered. "Hush," their mother scolded. "It's only temporary." Grandma Edith's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Come, I'll show you." As they followed her down the hallway, the wooden floor groaned beneath their steps. Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that the house was breathing, watching. She didn't want to be here. The house that never sleeps. That night, Hannah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the trees. Jake was fast asleep in the twin bed beside hers, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. But something felt off. The hallway beyond their door creaked, as though someone was walking ever so slowly. Hannah held her breath, listening. One step. Another. The sound stopped right outside their door. She squeezed her eyes shut. Maybe it was her mom. Maybe. The door handle rattled. Her stomach clenched in fear. Then a voice. Whispering. "Hannah, are you awake?" Her blood turned to ice. It wasn't her mother's voice. It was Grandma Edith's. Hannah stayed perfectly still, hoping, praying she would go away. A long silence stretched between them. Then the sound of slow, deliberate breathing. A shadow slipped under the door, thin, spindly fingers creeping through the gap like ink spreading across paper. Hannah slapped a hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. Then, just as suddenly, the shadow retreated. The floorboards creaked again, footsteps moving away, disappearing into the depths of the house. Hannah didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The warning. The next morning, Hannah stumbled into the kitchen, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Her mother was already seated at the table, sipping tea while Grandma Edith stirred something in a pot on the stove. "Did you sleep well?" Grandma Edith asked without turning around. Hannah hesitated. "Yeah," she lied. Her mother smiled tiredly. "See, it's not so bad here." Hannah glanced at Jake, who was uncharacteristically quiet, pushing his food around on his plate. Something was wrong with him. She was about to ask when Grandma Edith placed a bowl of oatmeal in front of her, the steam curling into strange shapes. "You'll feel better after you eat," she said, her eyes never leaving Hannah's face. Hannah swallowed hard. That afternoon, she wandered the house, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The rooms were filled with antique furniture, old dolls sitting lifelessly on dusty shelves, their glass eyes reflecting her every move. Then she found the study. It was lined with bookshelves, but one thing caught her attention, a framed black and white photo on the desk. It was an old picture of her grandmother, and behind her stood a dark, looming figure. Hannah's pulse quickened. As she leaned in for a closer look, a whisper crawled through the air. "You shouldn't be in here." She spun around. Jake stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with something close to fear. "Jake, what's wrong?" He hesitated before whispering. "She doesn't sleep, Hannah. Ever." A chill ran down her spine. "What are you talking about?" Jake's lower lip trembled. "I saw her last night, just standing in the hallway, watching." Hannah felt her heart drop. Jake grabbed her wrist, his fingers ice cold. "We have to leave." But before she could. "The evil granny who never sleeps. And she's watching you." Part 2, The House of Whispers. Hannah's heart pounded so hard she thought it would burst from her chest. Grandma Edith stood in the doorway, unmoving, her black eyes gleaming like polished stones. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing, child," she murmured, voice as brittle as dry leaves. Jake tightened his grip on Hannah's wrist. Neither of them spoke. Grandma Edith tilted her head, the motion eerily unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her footsteps making no sound against the wooden floor. Hannah exhaled sharply, realizing she had been holding her breath. She exchanged a glance with Jake. His small hands trembled. "We need to tell Mom," he whispered. Hannah nodded, but deep down, she knew their mother wouldn't believe them. Adults never did. The sleepless night. That night, Hannah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The events of the day replayed in her mind. The old photograph, Jake's warning, and the way Grandma Edith had just appeared. She glanced at Jake. He was curled up on his side, eyes shut tight, but his breathing was uneven. He was scared too. Floorboard creaked. Hannah's entire body tensed. The sound was faint at first, soft, almost hesitant. Then it grew louder, deliberate. Someone was walking in the hallway again. She squeezed her eyes shut. "Please let it be Mom." Another creak, closer this time. Then silence. A long, unbearable silence. Hannah opened her eyes just a fraction. The dim light from the hallway cast a sliver of illumination into the room. A shadow moved across the floor. Something was standing outside their door. A slow, scratching sound filled the air. Not knocking, scratching, like nails dragging along the wood. Hannah's breath hitched. Then her door handle twisted. Her blood ran cold. The handle rattled again, more aggressively this time. She could hear the faint sound of breathing on the other side. Shallow, ragged. The door never opened. Instead, something slid under the gap. Long bony finger. Hannah clamped a hand over her mouth to stop herself from screaming. The finger curled slightly, the nail scraping against the wooden floor. Then it withdrew. The footsteps retreated down the hall, growing fainter until the house fell silent once more. Hannah didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The warning. At breakfast, their mother was already at the table, sipping her tea as if nothing was wrong. Grandma Edith stood at the counter, stirring something in a pot. She didn't look at them. Jake sat down hesitantly, barely touching his food. Hannah took a deep breath. "Mom," she started, choosing her words carefully. "I don't think we should stay here." Her mother sighed, rubbing her temples. "Hannah, we've been over this. It's just for a few months." "No, you don't understand," Hannah pressed. "Something's wrong with this house. With her." Her mother set down her cup. "Hannah, stop it." "But Mom." "Enough." Her mother's voice was sharp, final. She glanced at Grandma Edith apologetically. "I'm sorry. She's just." Grandma Edith turned slowly, fixing Hannah with an unblinking stare. "Children have such active imaginations," she said, voice silky smooth. Hannah swallowed hard. "I think a little fresh air would do you both good," Grandma Edith continued. "Why don't you and Jake go outside for a while?" Jake looked at Hannah, eyes pleading. "Don't leave me alone." But what choice did they have? Locked door. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained gray and heavy. Hannah and Jake wandered through the overgrown backyard, staying close together. "We have to get out of here," Jake whispered. Hannah nodded. "But how? We can't just leave Mom behind." Jake hesitated. Then in a low voice he said, "I found something last night." Hannah's brows furrowed. "What?" Jake glanced toward the house before motioning for her to follow. He led her around the side, past the rotting fence, to a small wooden door built into the foundation. "I think it leads to the basement," he said. Hannah frowned. "So?" Jake bit his lip. "I heard something down there last night." A chill ran down Hannah's spine. "Like what?" "Like whispering. And something moving." Hannah felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," she muttered. Jake shifted uncomfortably. "Hannah, what if?" A soft creaking sound made them both freeze. Slowly they turned. Grandma Edith stood on the porch, watching them. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. And she was smiling. "The evil granny who never sleeps. And she's watching you." Part 3, The Basement Secrets. Hannah's heart pounded as she locked eyes with Grandma Edith. The old woman stood eerily still on the porch, her pale lips stretched into a thin, unnatural smile. The wind barely ruffled her long gray hair, and her eyes, those cold, lifeless eyes, never blinked. Jake gripped Hannah's sleeve tightly, his small fingers trembling. "Come inside, children," Grandma Edith called, her voice strangely melodic. "It's almost time for dinner." Hannah forced herself to nod, pretending everything was normal. "Okay, Grandma." She took Jake's hand and walked back toward the house, her stomach twisted into knots. As they passed Grandma Edith, Hannah caught a whiff of something foul, an acrid metallic scent, like rusted iron mixed with decaying flowers. It made her stomach churn. The moment they stepped inside, the heavy door creaked shut behind them. Grandma Edith's bony fingers brushed against Hannah's shoulder, sending a shiver down her spine. "It's dangerous to wander where you don't belong," she murmured. Hannah swallowed hard. "We were just exploring." Grandma Edith chuckled softly, her laughter like dry leaves scraping against stone. "Of course, little explorers. Always so curious." She turned away, humming to herself as she glided into the kitchen. Hannah exhaled shakily, exchanging a terrified glance with Jake. She knew Hannah realized. She knew they had found the basement door. Planned to escape. That night, Hannah couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the house breathe around her, the slow creaks of the old wood, the faint whisper of the wind through the cracks. And then, something else. Soft footsteps. Door creaking open. Hannah bolted upright, her breath catching in her throat. She turned toward Jake's bed. He was still there, fast asleep. The footsteps moved down the hall, slow and deliberate. Hannah slid out of bed, careful not to make a sound. She crept toward the door and pressed her ear against the wood. A faint whisper drifted through the crack. "Don't fight it, don't fight it." Her entire body went cold. She barely dared to breathe as she peeked through the keyhole. Grandma Edith stood in the hallway, facing the wall. Her head twitched slightly, her fingers moving as if tracing invisible symbols on the surface. Her lips moved, whispering words Hannah couldn't understand. Then she turned her head. Not her body, just her head. Slowly, unnaturally, her neck twisting at an impossible angle, until her eyes locked directly with Hannah's through the keyhole. Hannah jerked back, clamping a hand over her mouth to muffle her scream. The whispering stopped. Silence stretched through the house. Then a soft rhythmic tapping on the door. Hannah squeezed her eyes shut. "Go away. Please go away." The tapping stopped. A moment later, footsteps retreated down the hall. Hannah remained frozen for what felt like hours before daring to move. She crawled back into bed, pulling the blankets over her head, her entire body trembling. She didn't sleep. The basement door opens. The next morning, Hannah was exhausted but determined. She needed answers. The basement. She had to see what was down there. After breakfast, she waited for the right moment. Grandma Edith was in the kitchen, humming softly as she stirred something in a pot. Their mother was busy in the sitting room, flipping through old books. Hannah nudged Jake. "Now!" They slipped out the back door and hurried to the basement entrance. To their shock, the door was slightly ajar. Hannah hesitated. This felt like a trap. Jake grabbed her hand. "We have to know, Hannah." She nodded. They pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick and musty, filled with a scent of damp earth and something else, something foul. A single dim bulb flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows along the stone walls. Shelves lined with old jars and tattered books filled the room. Then Hannah saw it. In the center of the basement was a wooden rocking chair. And in that chair sat something, or someone. Woman. Or at least what used to be one. Her skin was paper-thin, stretched tightly over her skull. Her mouth hung slightly open, revealing blackened gums and broken teeth. Her eyes were sunken, lifeless. She wasn't breathing. But the worst part. She looked exactly like Grandma Edith. Hannah's stomach lurched. She clapped a hand over her mouth, forcing back a scream. Jake backed away, his face pale. What is this?" A slow creaking noise filled the air. The rocking chair. It was moving. Then from the shadows a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." Hannah turned just in time to see something move in the darkness. Not Grandma Edith. Something else. Something watching them. The evil granny who never sleeps. And she's watching you. Part 4. The thing in the basement. The whisper echoed through the basement, crawling over Hannah's skin like icy fingers. "You shouldn't have come here." Jake whimpered, gripping Hannah's hand so tightly it hurt. The rocking chair creaked, moving back and forth, though the corpse-like figure in it remained still. Then a soft wet sound. The figure's mouth twitched. Small movement. Then another. A slow, shuddering breath rattled through its chest. Hannah yanked Jake back just as the corpse's eyelids fluttered open. Deep, sunken eyes, milky and lifeless, locked onto them. The mouth opened wider, an unnatural gurgling sound rising from its throat. Then, from behind them, footsteps. Hannah whirled around. Grandma Edith stood at the bottom of the stairs, watching them. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice calm, emotionless. Jake squeezed Hannah's arm, his entire body shaking. Hannah tried to keep her voice steady. Who is that?" Grandma Edith smiled, a slow, stretched grin that didn't reach her eyes. "That," she said, tilting her head toward the chair, "is me." Hannah's breath caught in her throat. Jake shook his head furiously. "No. No, that's not possible." Grandma Edith took a step closer. "Oh, but it is. And now that you've seen her, you understand why I never sleep." The thing in the chair let out a long, rattling exhale. And then moved. The bony arms twitched. The fingers curled against the chair's armrests. Then, with a sickening crack, the head snapped toward them. Hannah screamed. She grabbed Jake's wrist and bolted toward the stairs. But Grandma Edith was already moving. Faster than she should be able to. Her feet barely touched the ground, her body gliding across the basement floor like a shadow. "You shouldn't run," she murmured. "You can't leave." Hannah shoved Jake ahead of her. "Go. Run." They scrambled up the stairs, bursting through the door into the backyard. The sky was an eerie shade of gray, heavy clouds pressing down on them. Hannah turned to slam the basement door shut. But Grandma Edith was right there. She reached out, her fingers claw-like, her grin widening. "You belong here now," she whispered. The door slammed shut. But not by Hannah's hands. Their mother stood there, her face pale, her breathing ragged. "Get inside," she ordered. Hannah didn't hesitate. She and Jake rushed past her into the house. Their mother turned to the basement door, pressing her hand against it. For a moment the wood thumped, something from the other side trying to push it open. Then a silence. Their mother exhaled shakily before turning to them. Her expression was grim. "You need to pack your things," she said softly. "We're leaving tonight." The truth about Grandma. Hannah sat on the bed, her mind spinning. "What was that?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Their mother sat across from them, rubbing her temples. "I was hoping you'd never have to know," she murmured. "Know what?" Hannah demanded. Their mother hesitated, then exhaled. "Your grandmother, she died 20 years ago." Hannah's blood ran cold. Jake shook his head. "That's not possible. She's here, she talks, she moves." Their mother nodded. "I know. But she's not alive." "Not really." Hannah swallowed hard. "Then what is she?" Their mother's hands clenched into fists. "A curse," she whispered. "A punishment. My mother, your grandmother, was obsessed with living forever. She feared death more than anything. And one day, she found a way." Hannah's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Their mother's eyes darkened. "She performed a ritual, something ancient, forbidden. It split her in two." Jake's voice trembled. "Split her?" Their mother nodded. "Her body died, but her spirit didn't. The part of her that should have moved on stayed. Trap. Now she exists in both forms, the dead, rotting body in the basement, and the part that still moves, still watches, still hunts." Hannah shuddered. "And she never sleeps." Their mother's expression tightened. "No, she can't. Because if she does..." She trailed off, her lips pressing into a thin line. Jake swallowed. "What happens?" Their mother exhaled shakily. "If she sleeps, the body in the basement wakes up." Silence fell over the room. Loud knock at the bedroom door. The three of them froze. Another knock. Then a voice, eerily calm. "Children, it's time for dinner." It was Grandma Edith. The evil granny who never sleeps. And she's watching you. Part 5, the final night. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. "Children, it's time for dinner." Hannah's throat tightened. The voice was warm, inviting, yet utterly wrong. It carried a hollow echo, as if spoken from the depths of something ancient and hungry. Jake clung to their mother's sleeve, his small body trembling. Their mother placed a finger to her lips. "Stay quiet." The doorknob rattled. Hannah could barely breathe. Another knock, louder this time. Then silence. The three of them waited, frozen in place, straining to hear any movement outside the door. Minutes passed. Finally, their mother exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to leave. Now." The escape plan. Their mother moved quickly, grabbing a small duffel bag from the closet. "Take only what you need," she instructed. "We don't have much time." Hannah hesitated. "But what about?" Noise cut her off. A deep, slow creaking from somewhere inside the house. The sound of footsteps. Heavy, dragging, moving toward them. Their mother's face paled. "The back door. We go now." Hannah and Jake followed her, their hearts hammering. Every shadow in the house felt alive, every creak of the floorboards a warning. As they reached the kitchen, the air grew wrong. Suffocating. The dim light above flickered, casting eerie, shifting shadows along the walls. And then, voice. "You're leaving." Hannah stopped dead in her tracks. Grandma Edith stood in the hallway, her face partially hidden in the darkness. But her smile, her awful, stretched smile, was fully visible. "You shouldn't go," she whispered. "You belong here." Her head tilted slowly, unnaturally. "With me." Their mother grabbed Hannah's wrist. "Run." Jake bolted first, but Hannah barely made it 2 steps before a hand, cold, impossibly strong, clamped onto her wrist. Grandma Edith's fingers felt like iron. "You don't understand, child," she murmured. "This house, it keeps me alive. And it needs you now." Hannah struggled, but the grip tightened. Her skin burned where Grandma Edith touched her, as if something unseen was seeping into her veins. Her mother lunged, gripping Grandma Edith's wrist with both hands. A low, inhuman hiss escaped from the old woman's throat. "Go!" their mother screamed. Hannah yanked free, stumbling toward Jake. Behind her, Grandma Edith snarled. "You can't leave." A horrible cracking sound filled the air. Hannah turned just in time to see Grandma Edith's form twitching, twisting, her body contorting as if something inside was trying to escape. Scream. Not a human one. A sound that rattled the walls, shaking the very foundation of the house. "She's waking up," their mother gasped. "Run!" The thing in the basement. They tore through the back door, the cold night air slapping against their faces. But behind them, the house groaned. A deep, unnatural vibration ran through the walls. And then, the basement door exploded outward. Shape emerged. It was her. The real Grandma Edith. Or what was left of her. The corpse that had been sitting in the rocking chair now moved, staggering forward, its gaping mouth twisting in unnatural jerks. Its eyes were open now, wide, milky white, but somehow focused. And then ran. The end of the nightmare. Hannah didn't stop to think. She grabbed Jake's hand and sprinted toward the trees at the edge of the property. Behind them, their mother followed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But the thing in the basement, it was faster. Closer. A deep, inhuman wail echoed through the night. Hannah risked a glance back. And nearly screamed. It was right there. Too close. Its bony fingers reached out. But then, the house shifted. The walls trembled. The roof groaned, sagging inward as if some unseen force was collapsing it from within. And then, with a deafening crack, the house caved in. A massive force pulled inward, sucking everything, including the thing that had been chasing them, back into the ruins. For one horrible moment, Hannah saw Grandma Edith's face, her mouth open in a silent scream. And then she was gone. The house imploded, leaving behind only dust, shattered wood, and a deep, hollow silence. The final truth. The three of them stood there, gasping for air, staring at the ruins. Jake clung to their mother's side. Hannah wiped at her face, her hands shaking. Is Is it over? Their mother exhaled. Yes, she said. The house is gone. And so is she. Hannah wasn't sure if she believed it. But one thing was certain. Grandma Edith would never watch them again. And finally, she would sleep. The end.